Okay, welcome back. This is the history of paper money. And what we're going to do this time is there was actually one extra chapter. This is kind of like an after story that Extra History does when they do their things where anything that they couldn't fit into their system, they try to explain it in this after story. And it looks like it's a really long one. So prepare to dig in here, people, because we're going to listen to this whole segment. So I don't want to make a giant next chapter without listening to everything that the original creator said. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this criticism I've had of their paper money history, and let's get into it.
Oh man, do we have a lot to cover today, and I've just rolled off a plane from Norway, so who knows if I'll even be coherent. But okay, you all know the rules. This is the exciting live action portion of the show where I tell you all the tiny fibs we made and regale you with tales of historical daring do, or at least tell some anecdotes. So first off, flags. If you see a British flag, be suspect. So I'm just basically gonna leave it at that and
Yeah, not important to this subject. Yeah, they get flags wrong in timelines and dates. I'm not regging into them about that.
never mention British flags again, in part because I'm totally to blame. I write the words, but half the time I'm on the road, and so I don't get to end up double checking the art before it airs. If there's ever a conflict between the two, trust the words, because when I screw those up, you know it's coming up in lies at least. But okay, so on to the first big one. I was super glad to see that a bunch you caught in the first episode when I started talking about barter. I sort of seeded it in there because I really wanted to talk about it, but the first time I wrote these episodes, whether or not barter was a real thing, it took up an entire episode, and so I had to cut it. But hence lies. So the idea that early societies worked entirely with a barter economy is sort of something that Adam Smith made up kind of out of thin air. And because he's had such a seismic impact on modern economic thinking, we basically took this off-the-cuff conjecture of his as fact forever. And then some anthropologists actually looked at it and essentially said, we can find 0 instances of barter-based societies. So then a bunch of archaeologists took a look at it and basically said, well, we find a ton of evidence for relatively long distance trade, even among very early societies. So how do you explain that, right? Because you'd think that any kind of sort of communal sharing or even a trust credit economy where I give you fish today and you give me a loaf of bread whenever the harvest comes in, that sort of thing would only work locally, where you knew and interacted with the people around you, right? So right now, as far as I can tell, and I'm no expert on this at all, we've sort of come to rest on a theory of gift giving with a little bit of haggling as the mode for early economies. But it's both a hot topic among academics and there's sort of little discussion of it at the lay level. So I just wanted to bring it up here because I found it so fascinating. The other thing I did was shorthand a bit on how fractional reserve banking.
Okay, just want to comment on that. That is an interesting debate. It's kind of, you have to kind of be concerned about falling too deeply into the narrative of the gift economy, or because this is usually something that's been perverted by people who are effectively communists. They want to go back and kind of put a noble savage theory into the primitive money systems. And yes, there were tribes, and tribes mutually supported each other, and you had primitive tribalism, which had communal elements in it. And yes, you would give a fish to somebody today for an exchange for something in the future. But that was in a time that was so primitive that your little tribe of 300 people were literally your second and third and fourth cousins. They were effectively your kin group. And if there was deadbeats, the group was small enough that like the guy said, and it worked locally. So the system could adjust to any corruption in that system by literally whipping somebody into shape. And if they wouldn't be whipped into shape, they could literally cut them off or kick them out. That's why banishment was so deadly of a punishment back in the day. But you just have to look out, because here they're not making any conclusive statements, but they're trying to say that usually what we or conclude is that bartering was for long distance trade. It was for foreigners that were coming in, and usually it was in durable stuff that could survive those kind of long journeys. So I don't really see there being any problem with, trading amber for, frankincense, over if you had some kind of long distance trade over that. You could do barter, and it wouldn't really be a problem with our understanding. You just have to watch out for people who say, "Oh, everything worked on natural credit and everything was great," because usually they're pimping some kind of communist theory, and they're just trying to impose their theory on the past and say that'll work in the current time period too. Let's keep going.
Actually works, right? In the very, very specific details. I said that you deposit $1,000 because your bank only needs to hold 10% in reserve. It can now lend out $10,000. What actually happens is you put in $1,000, it can now lend out $900 holding that 10% in reserve. And when it gets it back, it can now lend out an additional $810 above that, right? So $1,710 in total, because it still has to hold 10% of the now $1,900 it has in reserve.
Not really relevant. Let's see here. This is relevant to fractional reserve system, but I just consider fractional reserve system in most cases to be fraud, unless it's dealing in termed cash deposits instead of demand deposits. I guess I'm just gonna have to keep pledging through this.
This becomes an asymptotic curve after a bunch of transactions means that in the end, the bank will be able to lend out $10,000 off that $1,000 you put in. But with the volume of transactions happening in modern banks, this is basically instant. And a lot of the economic models I looked at essentially assume that the economy operates at close to full fractional reserve capacity. So for simplicity's sake, you can basically think of it as, I put $1,000 into the bank can now lend out $10,000. Unless you're trying to take some very thorough model of the economy at a very, very sort of specific snapshot in time. Which leads us to talk about fractional reserve banking in general. There are people out there who are very adamant that we should do away with it entirely and go back to the way things were before. But this is sort of like saying that we should do away with electricity because you're worried about anthropogenic global warming.
This is kind of a dishonest argument, because I've made this argument before in the previous episodes. The solution that fractional reserve banking offers is in increasing the money supply is only good for debtors. It's not good for savers. So basically, you had within basic economics of commodity currencies a balanced scenario. You have these guys presenting frequently saying, "Oh my God, it's a problem that too much currency is going in one direction." And no, it's not. It's just price value, supply and demand will adjust. A balance will be achieved, and people will adjust to this new balance. It's not really a problem. Now, if you are a debtor and there's deflation, you are in big trouble, but it's only if you are a debtor. So frequently, they have presented this as a problem faced by everyone, by all groups of people, that's holding back society. And it's not really. It's only holding back debtors. And honestly, with all of the economic shenanigans and fraud and wars, it's hard to make a case that holding back debtors isn't a good thing. That if we could keep debtors on a little bit tighter leash and keep them from doing the dumb and destructive stuff that they do when they have access to cheap or free money, that would actually be a good thing for society rather than a bad thing for society.
Yes, some of the concerns are totally legitimate, but the response is not super well thought through. Both of these technologies, and you really have to think about innovations in finance as technology, can, like all of mankind's technologies, be used well, but also have the potential to do harm.
Well, here's the thing. Uh, yes, this is true. However, you've basically ignored the downside in all of these cases. I see you've got the picture of the bank run here. Basically, you've justified the cheating with the warfare aspect, but I want less war. I don't want more war. I might even want less government instead of more government. And all this system that you've done is increase both of those things. And so, if my government is taking the fractional reserve system and then they're using it to do bad things, like I said, they're harvesting the ignorant in order to get more power, and then they're doing bad stuff because they're not constrained by all the other powers. They're legitimately doing bad stuff with it. So, we put limits on all sorts of other stuff. And this is really just a question of, should governments and central banks have this much power and authority? Can we really trust them with this much power? Or does it inevitably lead to a situation where they have too much power and they become corrupt because they have too much power and they actually work against the best interests of people? So I get your argument that you're saying that the system itself is neither good or bad. I am just looking at the outcomes of the system and saying that it has been done, more bad has been done than good with this system. And you're also ignoring that the previous system was balanced. There's not this huge problem of being held back by a limited supply of money that you're arbitrarily creating. You really haven't fleshed out how this is a problem. It's only a problem if, one, if you're a debtor, and two, you're only measuring the economy in terms of the money supply, and you're not measuring the economy in terms of total goods and services available.
A systemic banking collapse because there's a giant run on the banks, which the banks can't cover because of the fractional reserve system, is unlikely. With the right oversight and handling of this technology, it becomes virtually impossible.
I'm going to lay out in the next one how this is just not true. Governments have done a good job of hiding obligations and defrauding people in such ways that they're ignorant of the ways that they've been defrauded and stolen from. But you're saying because the central bank can print infinite money, it's impossible for there not to be enough money for people to take out of the bank. But all that does is shift you from a banking crisis to a currency crisis. It doesn't actually solve the problem.
And we can argue all day about whether we've achieved a high enough level of regulation. And that's a hugely important and totally valid discussion, just as it is with our use of electric energy. But the whole world uses this system today, and it's allowed us to expand our economies to where they are right now.
Wrong.
To simply try and turn back the clock is, I believe, impossible, and if achievable, would be disastrous.
Well, let's take what is kind of a new innovation recently in the form of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has a fixed supply, it has no central bank, and it's been accepted as a means of exchange. Now it's gotten to the point where it's become so valuable that it's actually pretty expensive to use it as a mean of exchange at this point. And that's just it's kind of changed roles. It's now more of a store of value than a means of exchange, but there are other cryptocurrencies that have kind of stepped up that have come into this place. But basically, you're saying that going backwards is that anything that would shift away from this system is going backwards, but really the stuff that we have now, that's the innovative stuff that's on this cusp of revolutionizing the system in terms of eliminating the ability for governments to defraud people through the stealing of their purchasing power and to go around banks that charge, that are basically just middlemen, that are basically just profiting off the backs of people by standing in between them and using a legal power to make profit for themselves. Instead, people are going around that middleman and cutting out the middleman and creating an efficiency. It's a good thing for humanity, and if we could decentralize this system, we're actually going to have a more stable system and a system that's easier to trust, and we're going to have a lot of the benefits that you get from being able to swipe your debit card at the gas station, and you're going to get it without all of the dangers of the having all of that power concentrated into the hands of a few, shadowy banking figures that are at the highest levels of government and get to decide whether they print up a few $1 trillion today for themselves and their buddies or not. I appreciate the way that he's approaching the topic, but I respectfully disagree, and that our current system, that the elements of our current system can easily be tossed out, and we can still have all of the modern benefits that we have today.
And then there's the argument about income inequality, which crops up around fractional reserve banking sometimes. And I totally feel that argument about distribution of wealth. It's a really important topic. But it's always weird to me when people tie that to fractional reserve banking, because the truth is there is no country in the world, no matter how liberal, no matter how well and equally distributed the income, that requires full reserve banking. And if you go back and look at a time before fractional reserve banking, income distribution wasn't any better. In fact, it was a lot worse. And it's easy to pin everything on fractional reserve banking because it feels like, oh, those bankers just get to invent money out of thin air while the rest of us have to work for it. But
this is kind of a sideshow, but here's the thing. Think about it from economic terms. The bankers only can justify that increase in the money supply that they increase if they're providing a good or service that materially improves our lives. If they're not doing that, if they've just gotten to the point that they're just a corrupt government bureaucracy, that they're just somewhere where money flows in and they get a nice chunk for themselves, and because they're in control of the organs of government and power, they have those cushy positions and they have those hands on those levers. And there's alternatives open to us, whether it would be 100% reserve system or it would be some kind of cryptocurrency that's decentralized that would allow us to bypass these people. It's not just I don't need the moral, the kind of liberal redistributive argument. I'm just going to go with the argument of they're outdated, that they are obsolete at this point, that we don't need these bankers that are enshrined in the current positions that they have, and they're only there being protected by government powers that allow them to retain their privileged positions through the government. So in this case, it's not government regulation that is helping us, as government regulation is basically enslaving us and keeping us shackled to a system that benefits them and only allows them to, say, wage bigger wars that they can profit from. Let's continue.
But when you need a loan to start a business or buy a car so you can get to a new job, it's that fractional reserve expansion, the money supply, that's what's getting you that loan. Without it, there just physically is no money there a lot of the time to give you that loan.
And this is kind of again the misnomer that that he's put forward here, that by increasing the money supply, somehow you've increased the desire to produce goods, and therefore we have somehow enabled something that wouldn't have happened previously. And this is just false because prices are infinitely malleable. Okay, so if all increasing credit does is it redistributes purchasing power to someone who doesn't have purchasing power. And you don't need a fractional reserve banking to do this. If you want to do a straight loan, you can do a straight loan. Or if you're a business, you can accept payment in installments directly from a factory instead of having a bank be a middleman that's protected by the government. There's any number of other ways to extend credit compared to just a fractional reserve banking system. And if you want to extend credit, nobody is stopping you from extending the credit if you are the owner of a factory or something, right? If you want to sell your cars for 10% down and 10% a month, that's great. Knock yourself out. Nobody's stopping you. The idea that you're putting forward here that the fractional reserve banking is the only solution to this problem, or that it wouldn't just balance itself out automatically, is a misnomer.
Which in turn means you sort of can't bet on yourself and your new business. And I don't even mean to be defending fractional reserve, right? It was just weird that it came up so much because I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. I mean, heck no, it's not at all. There are all sorts of dangers and flaws associated with it, but that's also true of practically any technology. And the answer isn't to just go back to the old ways any more than it is to give up on electricity to save us from global warming.
You would say that if you are a corrupt banker that's got new technology is ready to dethrone you. That's what I gotta throw out there. That all of the negatives of the gold standard can basically be tossed by creating a few private institutions operating with a commodity-backed cryptocurrency.
We need to find better answers. But, all right, let's jump back to the episodes because there's some rad stories here. First up, episode 2. I had the hardest time figuring out what was going on because certain ancient Chinese coins are called cash. But this is totally etymologically distinct from our English word cash. And by the way, it's only called cash in English. And so I would be reading these books and they'd be talking about cash. And then they'd talk about some completely other form of money. And I'd be like, what? Wait. There's money that isn't cash money? And besides sounding like I was talking about Lil Wayne's recording label, I ended up deeply confused. And then I found out that the English word cash comes from the Tamil word for coin and means a very specific type of Chinese coin, whereas our word cash, spelled exactly the same way, comes from the French word for money box. Confusing. And get this. I mean, as I said, this is only in English. In Chinese, there's a completely different word that sounds totally different for this same coin and is non-confusing. But only in English, where we have another word for that is cash, do we call them cash. But okay, on to a less confusing but equally hilarious note. The first paper money in China was often referred to as flying money because people hadn't totally gotten a handle on the whole wallet thing, and so sometimes they would take out their money and the wind would just blow it away because nobody was used to paper money. And you know that fellow who got strangled with a bowstring? Well, he really was much into innovation, and when he copied the Chinese paper money, he really copied it, like right down to the Chinese characters. And so the money in what is now in the middle of Iran had Chinese characters on it. And those goldsmiths that basically became banks in episode 3, I think. Many of those informal banks did actually become the first official banks, as they found out that holding and lending money was actually a better racket than shaping gold. What else? Oh, okay. Also in episode 3, that might have been episode 2 actually. But anyway, also in episode 3, remember when I mentioned that the English established the Bank of England to help sort of massively expand the Navy? I read at least one really interesting theory that this helped kickstart the Industrial Revolution because they had to build new foundries to make enough nails and new clothwork to make all the sails. Oh,
Come on, man. If all you can industrialize is murder, then we don't need it. Come on, dude. Say something anti-war, please.
and when I mentioned that some of the ideas about paper money had been sort of in the milieu and kicking around, it was John Locke and David Hume. David Hume being one of my favorite philosophers. They had both touched on some of these ideas in their writing before Barbon got to it. But to me, Barbon is really the first to do it in a serious, sort of full exploration of this idea. And speaking of Barbon, there are so many stories I couldn't fit in, but remember how I said that he did a few stints in Parliament to avoid prosecution? Well, at the time, you couldn't prosecute a sitting member of Parliament.
I'm going to try to jump forward to some of the pictures here that seem like they're more relevant to the subject. The individual people are kind of interesting, but they're not what I'm worried about. I don't need to hear about Walpole. Let's see what this Federal Reserve picture is.
So let's move on to episode 5 and talk about the U.S. Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was made in part to respond to what is called the U.S. period of wildcat banking. During this period, there were no federal regulations on banks, so basically they all just issued their own banknotes, and many of them did it so profligately that they would just go bust all the time. And the US needed a reliable banking system to support its ever-growing commercial role in the world.
Well, we still had gold and silver for that then. So what's the problem, dude?
So the Fed was created to issue a stable single banknote for the country to use and to serve as the lender of last resort for banks that were fundamentally sound, but momentarily couldn't meet the demands of their customers for cash because of a bank run. And this is supposed to be one of the checks on the fractional reserve system, right? One of the fears with fractional reserve banking is that it will allow a bank to lend out a lot more money than it has on hand. And then, if a ton of people all want to get out their money at once, the bank could collapse because it's lent out most of the cash that it owes to all the people who deposited money. Which in turn means that if the bank goes bust, anyone who didn't get their money out right away will be screwed. The Fed is supposed to solve this by essentially lending banks with good loans that they can eventually collect on enough liquid currency to meet short-term runs on the bank. So this,
I'm going to pause right here. I want to ask to anybody that thinks they know, is this what the Federal Reserve actually did during, say, the 2008 crisis? Because I hear him saying this, it's like, oh, there are good banks, and people are just scared and they're pulling the money out of the good banks, and so the Federal Reserve has to loan them money. The thing is, that's not actually what happened. There were legitimate crap loans made during the housing crisis, and you had tons of banks making tons of crap loans that they knew weren't going to be repaid. Okay, they got them off the books as quickly as they can. The rating agencies overrated them at a investment grade level, AAA, and then they got rid of them, and they knew that these were subprime mortgages and that they were just going to blow up at some point, right? And so what the Federal Reserve actually did, they did two things. They got they started adding to their balance sheet, which basically means they started printing money. And when they printed money, the two main things they bought were, one, they bought U.S. treasuries, which means they effectively enabled the United States government to borrow more money than it otherwise would be able to just to do whatever the hell they want, to bomb brown people in foreign countries, or to fund a bunch of welfare programs without having to raise taxes to legitimately pay for them, or basically just kept the government going when the government should have had to reform itself, when the government should have had to rein itself in and say, guys, we can't keep spending like this, because if we do, we're going to break the system, and we just can't keep doing it, because eventually the interest on our bonds, on our debt, is going to be so high that all the money that we tax isn't even going to cover the interest that we owe on the debt. And they didn't want to reach that point, because they knew if the Fed did not buy the debt that had been issued during that time period, if the Fed had not artificially kept interest rates down, there would have been such a demand for loans to the government that they would have had to pay a higher interest rate. And just to give you an idea, we're just going to use rough numbers right now, but right now the government debt is about $20 trillion. And so if they have to pay a $5 trillion pay interest on that, let's say they have to pay 5% on $20 trillion. Well, that's $1 trillion every single year that they have to pay in interest. Okay, so if that's a lot of money. Well, the United States government only really brings in between $3 and $4 trillion a year, and it's broken up between, we're talking about everything. We're talking about Social Security, we're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, we're talking about the military, all of it, right? And $3 to $4 trillion a year is kind of like government spending is in between those numbers, and so $1 trillion a year of interest can make or break the system. And there's nothing that says that interest rates have to stop at 5%. Interest rates have been as high in the past as 20%. So if that means we would literally have to pay every last cent that we bring in would have to be used just to pay the interest on the debt. So that's one of the things that the Federal Reserve did. It just bought as much debt as they could to enable the government, instead of having to have the government act wisely and responsibly and pass legitimate taxes where it would legitimate taxes, and to cut back on spending where spending was wasteful. They enabled the government to keep doing whatever it wanted without any check on it, and they did it by stealing, by printing money and stealing purchase power from everyone that held U.S. currency. That's one of the two things that the Federal Reserve did during the 2008 crisis. The other thing that it did during the 2008 crisis is buy a lot of the what they call them toxic assets, the bad house loans that were created during the subprime mortgages that were all bundled up and that they knew were worth pennies on the dollar. That these loans were bad loans. They knew the people were going to not be able to pay the mortgages. And it's not what he is describing here, where they're supporting good banks and good loans. They supported bad banks and bad loans simply to keep their system propped up. So they printed fresh money and stole purchasing power from everyone that hold the currency in order to save a few bad banks and a few people that made bad decisions. And if you're going to come at me and say, well, there would have been some innocent people that had money deposited in those banks that would have been hurt if we allowed those bad banks to go under. That's what you have the deposit insurance for. If you want to try to come to me and make a moral argument that we should fund with taxes a legitimate system of backing people's bank deposits, then that's fine. If people had a basic checking account and somehow their money got into a bad housing loan somehow, I have no problem with having that debate that maybe we should bail out those individuals who are affected. If you were some kind of multimillionaire or billionaire and you were wheeling and dealing and speculating on housing, I have absolutely no reason to want to get involved in that. If you got caught up with it, and your bank just happened to be a bad bank, and your deposits were put in the threat that way, yeah, let's have that discussion and see if we can, through legitimate means, back your deposits up with deposit insurance. But to argue that they saved good banks is just bullshit. They saved the bad banks. They went and bailed out specifically the bad companies, and they gave money to banks so they could buy the bad banks, and then they could just hold on to the bad assets. And to this very day, the Federal Reserve still has a lot of these crappy mortgages that are never going to pay off. And all they have done is isolated the problem. They shifted the problem from the banking system and they moved it to the government level. And I'll get into more of this later, but it has to do with what I see as the next change coming in the system going forward.
This doesn't happen. And this is good for everybody. But it comes with one danger, something which is usually referred to as moral hazard. Because what happens when you start getting too lax with this? What happens if you stop being as rigorous about the fact that you're making sure that the banks you're acting as the lender of last resort to actually have good loans out there rather than wildly risky garbage?
Which is exactly what they did.
Well, you're not really acting as the lender of last resort then. You're just bailing out the banks. And when that happens, you hit moral hazard, which is the idea that people are very much more likely to do risky things if they know that they will get to reap the reward if the risk goes well, while at the same time not having to suffer the consequences if things go wrong.
So this is basically the phenomenon that you get anytime the government backs a business or a loan and a government issues a guarantee, you get this process that he's describing here.
I mean, you're basically handing a gambler someone else's money and saying, if you win, you get to keep all of it. If you lose, you don't have to pay it back. And that's the root of the 2008 banking crisis. That's fundamentally what the whole credit default swap thing is, right? Banks making horrible garbage loans in the slim hope that they pay off, and then finding ways to package them up so they're hidden, so most of the world doesn't know, and then selling them as if they weren't horrible garbage loans. Until I guess the whole system is so flooded with garbage loans that don't actually pay off that the whole global economy collapses. And that behavior will just continue if you keep creating moral hazard of bailing out the banks. Because doing so means that high risk, high reward behavior just becomes high reward behavior. And I'm actually not one of those people who says we should just let the banks collapse, right? Again, that's one of those let's set fire to the house to get rid of the termites sort of solution.
Yeah, but we shouldn't let bad banks survive and keep continuing to do the same behaviors as before, because then you're setting up a system where bad behavior is rewarded, and when you reward bad behavior, you get more bad behavior. So if we are getting rid of a system that enables bad behavior, well, that's just what we need to do.
And we can do better. But this doesn't mean that there were no answers, right? That we couldn't find a way to avoid the moral hazard by, say, holding the people at the highest ranking positions culpable for what happened to the global economy, or breaking up the banks by having the federal government basically buy the failing banks and then selling them back to other parts of the financial industry. Or when they recovered, to simply garnish earnings of the bank until they had paid what they owed the U.S. taxpayer, say twice or three times over. So we have to find a way to escape this moral hazard. Since we're talking about the Fed, there also seems to be some misconceptions about the private nature of the Fed. Many people seem to think that meant that the Fed was a standard for-profit bank. Well, it's really more of a semi-private corporation. It's essentially a private company whose board is appointed by the elected president of the United States, whose officers are split between being appointed by the federal government and nationally chartered banks, and whose stock, sort of by law, every nationally chartered bank has to buy into, for which they get a 6% dividend on their investment. And where every other cent of the profit the Federal Reserve Bank makes goes back to the federal government. Of the $100 billion in profit the Federal Reserve made last year, it gave $97 billion of it back to the government, i.e. saving the taxpayers $97 billion the government would have otherwise needed to raise to run. And so it's not what you usually think of when someone says corporate bank. That said, like all the others, right, this system is very far from perfect. All the moral hazard stuff I talked about comes about in part from the fact that while in theory the governing board of the bank is appointed by the president specifically to avoid the banks regulating themselves and having the option to bail themselves out, too often even the academics who are given these positions have ties to major players in the financial industry. And I'll admit, it's a tough problem. I mean, how do you get enough people who are qualified to manage something as economically complex as the Fed without them having practical experience in the field? But in my very admittedly layman's opinion, if you're looking to keep the banking system acting not in an altruistic manner, but at least in a responsible, self-serving manner, figuring out how to do that might be a good place to start. One last random thing.
I'm going to stop him here because I just want to put forward part of the problem is that he approached the problem with the Fed as a problem of the bankers, influencing the government, which is legitimate, and we can look at it that way. We also have to look at it from the other angle where government spending has forced the Fed's hand off often. So when you get a government that decides to run trillions and trillions and trillions in dollars in deficits, and the only way they can sell that amount of bonds is to have the central bank print money and buy those bonds, that's the government itself pushing the bank. And it's the government that is engaging in the risky behavior in that instance and using that tool of money printing that supposedly the private organizations have, but really is being pushed by demand of the government. So basically you have a runaway government that's using an unlimited printing press to enable its bad behavior in terms of war spending and overpromising people benefits without raising taxes. Let's keep going.
About government agencies and attempts to minimize damage done by banks going belly up. Someone in the comments asked what FDIC insurance was. It's basically a system of insurance that the government mandates every bank carry to protect sort of you, the depositor, from the bank going bust. Basically, if your bank fails and they can't repay you, the first $100,000 in your account will be paid back to you out of this federal insurance fund. I haven't even talked about the petrodollar yet.
Okay. FDIC insurance, I talked about that a little bit earlier. That's the government backing, let's bail out the individual people instead of the dirty banks. And the problem, there is sort of a problem with this in the fact that the amount of money paid in for FDIC insurance is nowhere near enough to cover what would be necessary in a major banking panic. So you would have a kind of a situation again where in order to fulfill all those obligations, the FDIC would ultimately have to turn to the Federal Reserve to print a bunch of money to fulfill those obligations. So it might be a better approach than bailing out, say, corrupt bankers to bail out directly the ignorant investors instead of directly and making the corrupt investors take the hit. But it's not a 100% way to solve the problem either.
So on to episode 6 about the gold standard. The first thing that you have to know about the gold standard is that it's actually Isaac Newton's fault, or at least the move from silver to gold was. Britain was hemorrhaging gold in its foreign trade and so needed to find a different standard. And Isaac Newton had been named Master of the Mint, which I think everybody considered basically...
I think he means silver, but let's keep going.
...a ceremonial job to pension off a famous old guy. But Newton took it very seriously, and soon he reformed the coinage. And because of the way he valued gold and silver ended up being used almost entirely to buy imports, thus sort of continuing to flood out of the country. And this is a problem we'll see crop up in the Opium Wars. And
Well, this is because they didn't let the price of gold and silver freely float between each other. If they had a freely floating exchange rate instead of an arbitrary rate imposed by the government, you wouldn't have had this problem.
a number of other times, but it did mean that gold was the standard for the internal currency. Oh, and speaking of Newton, did I mention that he lost his shirt in the South Sea bubble and was miffed about it basically until his dying day? He wouldn't even talk about it. But okay, petrodollars. Then I'm going to collapse and fall asleep for 14 hours. Okay, so remember when I mentioned that people pegged their currency to the dollar after World War II because the dollar was the only thing left on the gold standard, because the US literally had more than half of the entire world's gold reserves in its vaults at that point. Well, a bunch of stuff happens, other economies get stronger, we drop some of our gold reserve, the gall kicks us in the teeth, and all of a sudden it doesn't make sense for us to be on the gold standard any longer.
Doesn't make sense, or we can't keep our promises anymore.
And I know some of you will shout, yes, the gold standard will always make sense, but honestly, after reading a ton on this, I can't really buy into that argument. And yes, it keeps inflation down, but the other costs are just too great. And I'll try and talk a little.
Well, I guess you must be a debtor then, you corrupt person, you. You only care about causing inflation to lower debts. You are corrupt. You are bad.
Bit about inflation in a second. But petrodollars, gold standard. Anyway, we get off the gold standard. Now we're in fiat money territory, right? The money that works because we all agree it works territory. But there are some people who would argue that we're actually not on fiat money. And this is an interesting and totally legitimate point to consider, because in 1971, the very year we left the gold standard, OPEC, the coalition of oil-producing nations, arguably at the prodding of the US, decided that they would only take US dollars in exchange for oil. This meant the whole world needed US dollars to buy the oil that the world now ran on, essentially making the US dollar backed by oil, black gold instead of yellow, which raises huge questions about what happens to the dollar if the OPEC nations ever decide, as they've been thinking about doing, and has some have to a very limited degree started to do, if they start accepting other currencies. If we're a true fiat currency, very little should happen. If we're still actually a commodity currency that just looks like a fiat currency, if we're still a commodity currency backed by oil, the currency should totally, just the bottom should drop out of the dollar if we lose that OPEC backing.
Now, I'm going to give this guy the benefit of, I guess, maybe a year or a year and a half has passed since he's made this recording, and the world has been gradually moving away from the petrodollar. I don't have a problem with his description of the history of the system. That's pretty accurate. You would also need to know that what the United States gave in an exchange for the Saudi promise is that we promise to keep the Saudi royal family in power with the United States military. Beyond this, what the kind of developments we've had in the last year and a half, the Chinese now have a petro yuan system, and so they have these key facilities that within China now you can trade yuan for oil, and or oil for yuan, which is the Chinese currency. You can also trade yuan for gold, and when we're talking about trading for gold in China, we're talking about trading for physical gold, like walking out with bars of gold. When you get a Westerner talking about trading gold, what they're usually talking about is trading a derivative of gold, which is a whole another giant can of worms to dig into, but basically, what you're talking about there is a futures market where they promise to provide you gold at some later date. It's not actually physical gold. So when you see the price of gold listed on the COMEX, the CME, or in London at their exchanges, what they're actually showing you is not the price to walk out with pallets of gold. It's showing you a system where 99 out of 100 people don't actually receive the physical gold. They're just trading paper promises to gold. So in that way, gold suffers from exactly the same problems that fractional reserve banking does. That we've got a system now where we have fractional reserve gold trading, where we have all of these people who hold, say, futures contracts that say that gold is deliverable, or they hold shares of something like GLD or SLV, where the organizations that sell those shares say that they promise that they're holding such and such amount of gold, but there's really not any backing proving that they have the amount of gold and silver that they say they have. So you're basically dealing with these shadowy institutions, and you're dealing with another practice. There's a couple of other practices I want to mention here. There's the practice of unallocated accounts, where you set up an account with a broker and you say, hey, I want you to buy me some gold. And the broker says, sure, I'll get you some gold. And really what he's done is written in an IOU in your account that says, I owe you whatever amount of gold. And they don't actually allocate, which means they don't actually have the gold in hand to actually provide that gold to you should you want it. And the other thing that I wanted to cover was, I honestly, I forgot it. But basically, there's all these mechanisms, options, electronic representations of gold and silver, derivatives of gold and silver, that aren't actually physical gold and silver, that you've reached the point that the supply of what is listed on the TV at the end of the night as the price of gold is not really the price of gold. It's the price of a paper derivative of gold that's had its system number multiplied by multiple times by all of these paper claims. And the other mechanism is gold leasing. So what happens is someone who may or may not have gold, like say the Federal Reserve, takes a big pile of gold and they lease it to bullion banks or other people that sell gold or silver. And when they when they lease that gold out to the system at large, they don't take it off their books. They list an IOU for gold as the same as actual gold and silver that they might have in the vaults. And there's nothing stopping from the people they lease it to from leasing it again and leasing it again. And each time they don't take the gold or silver off of their books, they list the IOU for gold as the exact same thing as gold. So you've got this tremendous amount of paper gold where a lot of people think they have claims on gold and they don't actually have the claims on gold. And so basically, when I've described this in the past where he says he's trying to solve problems of bank runs, and I'm saying, no, all you have done is shifted the problem from the bank level to the currency level, that's the setup for my final kind of talk that I'm going to give in the next episode, where I explain how I feel the future is going to play out when we finally get to the end of this current system. And what you're going to see is basically not a run on the bank to get paper money. You're going to see a run on paper money to get real things of value, to get gold and silver. And what we're going to find is that we have printed so many claims and artificial representations of gold and silver that the price price of gold and silver is actually radically out of whack. And so you're going to see them shoot up in price dramatically one night as the value of paper currencies radically declines. So let's see what the rest of this is about.
My completely uneducated guess is that the dollar will take a hit, but it won't be catastrophic. Again, I am a total layman on this, but from what I've seen, I think enough people have believed in the dollar as a fiat currency for long enough that it's actually just truly become one.
What I would tack on there is a lot of the backing is actually the perceived might of the U.S. military, because the military side of this, the U.S. contribution to this side was, we promised to protect Saudi Arabia with our military. And so basically, if at any point the U.S.'s military power degrades to the point that we're no better than, say, China or Russia, then the value of the U.S. dollar will take a major hit in that aspect.
But I guess that'll lead me back to talking about the arguments for getting back on the gold standard. Basically, if your money's on the gold standard, you effectively have no inflation. This is great if you're super rich, because if you have inflation and your money's losing...
It's not great if you're super rich. It's great if you have savings. Okay? If you can save some money, it's good for you. And let's be honest, you don't have to be rich or poor to save some money. You just have to live under your means.
A few percent per year, that's a big deal if you're sitting on a huge pile of money, right? And it means that you're gonna have to keep working if you wanna maintain that pile of money. But if you're not super rich, it's less of a big deal because you tend to convert most of your income into stuff anyway.
No, that's if you are a overspending glutton that goes into debt.
Anytime you use your money to pay the rent or buy a new TV or get a bite to eat or take a vacation, effectively that money is not affected by inflation for you because you've spent it, and inflation happens over time. Now, large amounts of inflation are bad for everybody because if you've got 10% inflation or whatever, that will eat right through whatever you've managed to put away to buy a house or a car or just saving up for a rainy day or retirement. But the small amounts of inflation like the US currently has at 1.5% is usually considered healthy by economists.
Just a point I want to make here about inflation. There's lots of arguments about what constitutes inflation, and there's two major different competing theories on it. One is from the kind of Keynesian theory that you're looking at you're measuring price levels. So you're measuring, the cost of bread. And if the price of bread goes up, that's inflation. That's one way of looking at it. The problem is I don't necessarily trust the government to honestly do inflation calculations anymore, because there's a lot of reasons that the government has to understate inflation, because there's two reasons. One is that whatever number the government decides to quote as the inflation number is directly taken out of the number that they list as GDP growth. So if they look at GDP growth and before they subtract inflation, GDP growth is 5%, right? Well, if they have 4% inflation, that means the real economy only grew at 1%. And the debate around political theater, just elections and back and forth and fighting about the economy, if you're the one in control of the government and your party has control, you don't want that inflation number to be high because you don't want that to come off of the GDP growth number, because that number has to be taken out of the GDP growth before it goes public. And you want to understate that number, and you are the boss of the people who report that number. So there's this kind of perverse incentive for the government to lie about the rate of inflation, because if you lie about the rate of inflation, you get to do a couple of things. One of them is you get to say the economy is actually growing faster than it is under your watch and make your party look better. The other thing is there's a lot of programs like Social Security where they have promised to increase the benefits called a COLA, or a cost of living adjustment. So basically, they want to make sure that the amount of retirement money that's going to retirees is keeping up with the rate of inflation. And the flip side of that is, though, if the rate of inflation is high, say it's 4 or 5%, that means I have to give a 4 or 5% increase in benefits to people, and then that puts a pressure on the federal government, because the federal government is always running deficits and it's always in debt, and so they would rather cheat the retirees and give them a smaller cost of living increase by underreporting inflation, and therefore keeping more of the money that we pay to pay for retirement funds in the government, and they can use that money, and they use all of that money literally to do other things, to buy government bonds, to run other programs, instead of actually giving it to retiring people. Let's keep on going.
Yes, it makes your savings worth a bit less every year, but it also ensures that the super wealthy don't just sit on their money and do nothing with it.
This is kind of a bullshit argument, because if the wealthy sit on their money and do nothing with it, then they are literally going to choke the economy. It's basically, the wealthy people are always looking for the next big thing that they can invest in, because times change, investments change. If you were a guy that invested in, let's use a modern example. You put a bunch of money in Dell Computer, like in the early 2000s. Dell was the shit. It was bigger than Apple. Michael Dell was a celebrity. They were the first place where you could order a computer online and you could customize it and blah, blah, blah. And let's say you were a super wealthy dude and you owned a bunch of Dell stock. Well, it wasn't too long after that computers stopped being the most important thing, and tablets and smartphones took over. And what happened? Tablets and smartphones, bam, Apple comes in, Apple takes over. Apple stock is now the number one technology company, and Dell is like some second-rate company that's still kind of around and still makes some stuff, and you can still buy a Dell computer, but they're nowhere near as big and giant as they used to be. So if you're a rich guy that just sits on his money, then you're that rich guy that's sitting on Dell stock. And you're going to miss the next innovation wave, and you're going to miss the switch from Dell to Apple. And those kind of switches are all throughout history, and so you can never expect this scenario that you see. A rich person that does that won't stay rich for very long. At least they won't stay super rich. They might always have enough money for food and housing and stuff, but they're not going to be one of the big players that's in control of the economy if they can't anticipate and invest in the next wave that's going to come into the economy.
It forces them to invest it in businesses or buy bonds from the government.
No, it doesn't. Listen, the reason that they're going to do that anyway without inflation, because if they don't catch the next wave, their wealth relative to the wealth that the people made who did the investing are going to be reduced drastically.
Putting that money to work for the economy rather than just hoarding it while a handful of people slowly live off of it.
And the other point to make here is that the rate of inflation is something that you have to take off the top of your investments anyway. So let's say you said this creates inflation, and then people are forced to go into the market. Well, let's say I go into the market and I make 10% on my investment, but inflation is 10%. Well, I didn't really make any money, did I? Because the inflation wiped out the gains that I made. So really, the only people that are benefiting from inflation are debtors, because debtors get to borrow money today and then pay back less money in the future, because there's more money in the future, and it's easier to get that amount of money, and so the value of their debts go down. So basically, we have a system that's enslaved to the needs of debtors, which is usually big governments that want to do big, wasteful things without having to check with the constituency if it's okay and should we raise taxes to do these things. No, they just want to spend money and do it right now.
It doesn't do much to help the whole income inequality thing, but it at least makes sure that all of the society's money remains productive in an economic sense. Crud, I thought I was done. And it reminds me of one other thing I have to talk about before I can go meet the sweet embrace of unconsciousness. And that is exorbitant privilege. I am not going to do justice to this at all here, and it's super complicated, but I thought it was really interesting, and so at least worth bringing up. But fundamentally, for quite a while, the US has been running what would normally be considered a completely unsustainable negative balance of accounts. We have way more imports than exports. There's more foreign investment in the US than there is US investment in foreign nations, etc., etc. Taken all together, in a ridiculously oversimplified form, it's sort of like a business spending more money than it makes. Usually that business either has to eventually cut spending or sell more stuff or go out of business. But here's where it gets crazy. Because the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency, there is an argument, first put forth by the French when they were still miffed about American economic dominance post-World War II, that the world using US dollars as their reserve currency gave us a ridiculous advantage. We could buy imports, goods from other countries, in our own currency. Now, normally, if France wants to buy something from Russia, the economy is going to have to export enough, the French economy is going to have to export enough to generate enough currency to buy enough Russian rubles to pay for whatever they want to buy. But if we in the US want to buy something from France or Russia, because they need US dollars as their reserve, we can just buy it in US dollars, which means we don't have to export enough to cover buying enough foreign currency to cover what we're actually importing. And here's where it gets a little too complicated for me. This is really weird, and I don't claim to fully know it. Don't trust me on this one. But as I understand it, that essentially means that to some degree, we can just print more money to buy things from other people. Not infinite, but a small amount. And normally printing money is a terrible idea unless you're expanding your economy. But what is the expansion of an economy? Additional goods and services. And what are we getting for the money we're printing? Additional goods and services. So basically, it's like we're using other countries' labor to expand our economy, or secretly making part of their economy ours, all because of the fact that everyone needs dollars. And the reality of this and the extent of its effect, if it's even real at all, is widely debated. And
Okay, I'm going to jump in here and kind of explain the implications of what he's saying. He says that basically we can get away with a certain amount of money printing because people use our money as their reserves and they're holding on to that. Well, logically, that works as long as they see value in retaining those dollars as reserves. So like you said, there's a limit. If we reach a point where it looks like we're printing more money than what we can get, or if for goods and services, or if that money isn't necessarily being spent wisely, like let's say every dollar that goes to buy, say, F-35s at a ridiculous rate, or goes to, I'm going to throw one for the left and one for the right, wasteful military spending for the left, or for the right, let's say we're going to pay poor people to have babies and create more poor people. So, excessive welfare state, keep the people fed and stupid kind of situation. Basically, that only works if we are actually getting something productive for those dollars. not necessarily every dollar that is being demanded, that every dollar that is being created is going towards something productive. And this is where it's kind of philosophical, but it's inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply. That's the Chicago. Well, they look at the increase of prices, whereas that's the Chicago school. Whereas the Austrian school looks like the actual physical amount of paper of money that's in the system. They don't look at the change of prices, and the difference in there is the velocity of money, and that's how quickly money is moving from one part of the economy to another part of the economy. Because if the money is moving quickly, it can, there's a multiplier effect. It can feel like there's a lot more money in the economy than there actually is if that money is changing hands quickly. So you can produce a lot more price inflation with the same amount of money if people are moving that money quickly. And what's the sort of thing that causes people to spend money quickly? It's if they start losing faith in the value of the currency. But that's what you're seeing, is that inflation, to sum it up, inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply. Hyperinflation, where people actually lose faith in the currency, where they say, oh my God, the government has gone down a course and it can't change course from what it's doing. It's going to have to keep printing, and then to cover what it's done, it's going to have to keep printing again and keep printing again. I've got to spend this money now. Basically, hyperinflation is caused by a lack of faith in the currency, that there's no way that the government is going to be able to keep up with its obligations anymore, and that everything is downhill from there. So that's when you have an actual currency crisis.
It's almost impossible to pin down. But the middle of the road stance seems to be that we're getting to write off about $50 billion a year in trade deficit because of this. But as mentioned, even that number would be hotly contested. Still, this idea of exorbitant privilege is an idea worth the examining. All right, now I think I'm free. Go check out the Kiners music, because it should be up at the same time as this.
Okay, I'm going to cut this guy off here. I found this one really interesting. I am going to do one more addendum where I am going to lay out what I see is what he's not looking at in the current system, where the current system is heading, where fractional reserve banking is heading, where fiat money is heading with the death of the petrodollar, as he alluded to. That basically that all of this is a cycle. It's going to come back and bite us in the ass. He's presenting this as progress in a straight line, where, hey, if we go back to a gold standard, we're going back in time, and it's not really a straight line progress. It's cyclical process. Basically, it's a cycle of trust, where basically a gold standard or a commodity standard is established. The system is trustworthy. We go through various challenges and in life and in the world, and then gradually over the time we see opportunities. We want to stretch to meet those opportunities, and we bend the rules in order to try to exploit those needs in the moment. And we kind of pervert the initial promises that we've made to people. And then sometimes those things pay off, and sometimes they don't pay off. Sometimes it's a wasteful war, and we've lost value, and there's a collapse, and everything collapses back into people only trusting commodity currencies and things of value. And I don't think you can avoid that cycle. It's a natural cycle. It's a business cycle. It's a boom-bust cycle. The idea that some economists in some room somewhere can warp human nature enough to not... It's a cycle of greed, and then it's a cycle of fear. Greed, fear, and it keeps expanding. And it's not to say that we can't make forward progress while we're doing this. We can be spiraling through this cycle of greed and fear of needing commodity-based currency because of all the lies that have been made and broken promises, to going back to a time of opportunities and authentically wanting to stretch to get to those opportunities faster, to being corrupted. It's just like human nature. We live, we mature, and then we die. And concurrencies are born, they mature, and then they die. It's just a cycle, and those cycles can continue even as technological progress continues. Anyway, in the final section, I'm going to give you my breakdown of what I think is going to go on in the final stage, which I see as a currency reset of the current end of the petrodollar and fiat system to what is going to be a new system based on cryptocurrencies and commodity currencies. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys for the last one.